The wind was a blade, slicing through the thin wool of her coat, finding every gap, every frayed seam. Elara huddled deeper into the meager shelter of the rock overhang, the snow-laden air burning in her lungs with each shallow breath. It had been weeks, perhaps months, since the cabin burned, since the smoke mingled with the scent of burning pine and something else, something acrid and final, since she ran, blindly, into the indifferent vastness of the mountains, leaving behind everything but the ragged clothes on her back and a terror that gnawed at her like the persistent hunger in her belly. She had walked until her feet bled, until her body screamed for rest, until the landscape blurred into a white, hostile expanse. Now winter had clenched its icy fist around the peaks, and Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her more than the air, that she could not survive it alone. The small fire she managed to coax from damp kindling flickered weakly, offering more smoke than heat. Her hands, chapped and raw, trembled as she tried to feed it a few meager twigs. Each movement was an effort, a testament to the depletion of her strength, the slow draining of her life force. Fear was a constant companion, a low hum beneath the roaring of the wind. Fear of the cold, of starvation, of the wild creatures whose eyes might gleam in the darkness, but most of all, fear of the solitude, the crushing weight of being utterly alone in a world that seemed determined to erase her existence. Her breath misted in the frigid air, visible evidence of a life fighting to cling on. She thought of Henry, his laugh, the warmth of his hand. The thought brought a fresh wave of pain, sharp and unbearable, a wound that time had not yet begun to heal. But grief was a luxury she could not afford. Survival was the only currency here. She scanned the desolate valley below, a vast canvas of white broken only by the dark, skeletal lines of trees. No sign of life, no wisp of smoke, nothing but the stark, beautiful, deadly indifference of nature. She was a tiny, fragile thing in a world built of stone and ice. The overhang offered some protection from the falling snow, but the cold seeped up from the ground, through her worn boots into her bones. She knew she needed more shelter, more fuel, more food, but her legs felt heavy as lead, her will fraying like the threads of her coat. Despair threatened to engulf her, a dark, suffocating wave. Was this to be her end? Freezing, alone, forgotten, a small silhouette swallowed by the white emptiness? She closed her eyes, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall. The wind howled, a mournful, lonely sound that echoed the cry trapped in her own chest. She wished, just for a moment, for someone, anyone to see her, to know she was here, fighting. Even if they offered no help, just the knowledge that another soul existed in this frozen wilderness would be a comfort. But there was no one, only the wind, the snow, and the silence. The long, terrifying silence of absolute solitude. She had to find strength. She had to. But where did it come from when everything felt gone? Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of cold, hunger, and a desperate search for firewood. Elara rationed the last of the dried meat she'd managed to salvage, each bite a solemn ritual against the gnawing emptiness in her stomach. Her fire was a meager thing, constantly threatening to die, a symbol of her own precarious hold on life. She had ventured further from the overhang, driven by necessity, her movements slow and clumsy on the treacherous, snow-covered ground. It was on one of these forays, searching for dry wood near a frozen stream, that she saw him. He was a shape in the distance at first, a dark figure moving with quiet purpose through the trees. Her heart leaped into her throat, a sudden violent flutter of fear and a strange, unwelcome sliver of hope. She froze, ready to flee, her body tense, prepared for threat. He didn't call out, didn't make a show of his presence. He simply moved, steadily, like a part of the landscape itself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in rough-spun clothes and thick furs, carrying an axe with an easy competence that spoke of long familiarity with the woods. He paused, his head turning slightly in her direction, and for a terrifying second, she thought he saw her. But he didn't approach. Instead, he continued his work, felling a dead pine with swift, powerful strokes. She watched him for a long time, hidden behind a thicket of spruce. He worked tirelessly, cutting the log into manageable lengths, splitting them with practiced blows. There was an economy of movement about him, a complete lack of wasted effort. He was a man of the mountains, she realized, one who belonged here in a way she never could. As the light began to fade, he shouldered a heavy load of split wood and began walking, not towards her overhang, but in a different direction entirely. Disappointment warred with relief. He hadn't seen her, or if he had chosen to ignore her. It was safer this way, perhaps, but the bitter chill of loneliness returned, sharper for the brief interruption. The next morning, she awoke to a profound cold. Her fire had died completely during the night. She shivered violently, her muscles aching. As she crawled out from under the overhang, intending to make another futile search for kindling, she stopped. Piled neatly near the entrance, protected somewhat from the falling snow, was a stack of firewood. It was cut to a perfect length, split and dry. More wood than she had gathered in weeks. Her breath hitched. She looked around frantically, but saw no one. Only the vast, empty landscape. He had seen her, and he had helped. But why? And who was he? Fear remained, a wary guard in her mind. But it was now tempered with confusion and a hesitant gratitude. She quickly set about building a fire with the precious wood. It caught easily, crackling merrily, sending warmth blooming through the overhang. She sat close to the flames, watching the smoke curl into the gray sky, her thoughts churning. He was a phantom, a silent helper in the wilderness. His anonymity was unsettling, his motives unknown. Was he dangerous? Or was this act of kindness all that it seemed? The weight of her solitude felt marginally lighter, replaced by the unsettling mystery of the man who moved like a shadow and left gifts of life-giving warmth. Over the following days, the pattern continued. He would appear at a distance, never close enough for her to get a clear look at his face, always moving with that same quiet, purposeful grace. Sometimes she would hear the steady rhythm of his axe echoing through the trees, a comforting sound in the immense silence. More often, she would simply find evidence of his presence. A pile of wood, larger and drier than before. A snare set near the stream with a small rabbit caught in it. Even once, a piece of dried fish left carefully on a flat rock. He never spoke, never waved, never acknowledged her directly when she saw him. He was like a benevolent spirit of the woods, offering succor without expectation or interaction. Alara's initial fear began to recede, replaced by a cautious acceptance, then a quiet, deep-seated gratitude. She learned his rhythm, the times he was likely to be near. She stopped hiding when she saw him, though she still kept her distance, observing him from afar. He seemed to sense this, never coming closer than was necessary to leave his offerings. There was a dignity in his silence, a lack of intrusion that allowed her to maintain her own small space, her own fragile independence within this strange, unspoken arrangement. She started leaving small things in return, a few carefully straightened stones near the overhang, a small bundle of spruce tips she'd gathered for tea, a silent acknowledgement of the exchange. She learned to read the subtle signs he left, the way the wood was piled, the direction he took after setting a snare. She saw that he lived further up the valley, a small cabin nestled almost invisibly into the landscape. He was not a wanderer, but someone rooted, someone who knew this harsh land intimately. This knowledge brought a different kind of fear of what might happen if he stopped, if he left, if something happened to him. She had come to rely on his silent help more than she dared admit. Her body was stronger now, her fear less paralyzing, but she was still utterly dependent on the resources he provided. One afternoon, the sky turned a sickly yellow-gray, and the wind picked up with a sudden ferocity. Snow began to fall, not in gentle flakes, but in thick, blinding sheets driven horizontally by the gale. It was a mountain storm, sudden and violent. Alara scrambled back to the overhang, the cold biting deep. The fire sputtered, threatened by the wind whipping under the rock. She saw him then, silhouetted against the white chaos, struggling against the wind, making his way towards her. He reached the overhang, shaking snow from his furs, his face obscured by the driving snow and the hood of his coat. He didn't speak. He simply knelt by the fire, shielding it with his body, adding larger pieces of wood, coaxing it into a strong, steady blaze. He stayed there for a long time, a solid, silent presence against the fury of the storm outside. For the first time, Elara did not feel utterly alone. There was a shared vulnerability in the face of the tempest, a quiet alliance formed not with words, but with actions and presence. As the storm raged, she watched him, this silent man who had become her protector, her lifeline in the white wilderness. Her gratitude swelled, a powerful, unspoken emotion in the roaring silence of the storm. The storm passed as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world buried deep in fresh snow. Kale, she had finally learned his name from marking on his tools. A simple, solid name was gone when she awoke, though a large pile of wood remained. The shared night under the overhang, silent but for the storm's roar, had shifted something between them. There was a new layer of understanding, still unspoken, but more tangible. Elara felt a surge of determination. She could not continue simply taking. She needed to contribute to prove her own capacity for survival, her own resilience. She spent the following days consolidating her small camp, improving the overhang's shelter against the wind, melting snow for water, and attempting to set her own small snares for rabbits, mirroring the method she'd observed Kale use. Her attempts were clumsy at first, but she persevered, driven by a need to stand on her own feet. Kale continued to leave supplies, but perhaps sensing her shift, he didn't leave quite as much food, focusing more on firewood. He still remained a silent presence, observing her efforts from a distance. One morning, as she was checking her empty snares, two men on horseback appeared at the edge of the valley. They were rough-looking, their faces hard, their eyes sharp and calculating as they scanned the desolate landscape. They spotted the smoke from her fire and rode towards it, their presence an immediate, palpable threat in the quiet valley. Elara's blood ran cold. She had heard stories of men like these, driven by greed and cruelty in the harsh frontier lands. She retreated towards the overhang, her heart pounding, searching frantically for any sign of Kale. The men dismounted, their gazes raking over her and her meager camp. "Well now, what have we here?" The taller one sneered, his voice thick and unpleasant. "A woman, alone in the dead of winter. Lost, are we?" His eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl. "I am not lost," Elara said, finding her voice despite her fear. It trembled slightly, but she held her ground. "This is my camp." The lie felt thin and fragile. The second man chuckled, a harsh, dry sound. "Your camp? Looks more like a hole in the rock. You got anything worth taking?" He stepped closer, his hand drifting towards the knife on his belt. Just as Elara braced herself, her mind racing with desperate possibilities, a figure emerged from the tree-lean above them. Kale. He stood there, axe in hand, silent and still, but his presence radiated a quiet, powerful warning. He didn't speak, didn't move towards them, but the two men stopped, their eyes flicking towards him. They knew him, Elara realized. Kale was known in these parts, a man best left undisturbed. The taller man hesitated, his smirk faltering. He exchanged a look with his companion. Kale didn't move, didn't make a sound, but his gaze was steady, unwavering. After a tense moment that stretched into an eternity, the tall man spat on the snow. "Ain't worth the trouble," he muttered to his friend. They turned, mounted their horses, and rode away, casting nervous glances back at Kale's silent figure. Elara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her legs felt weak with relief. Kale remained where he was until the riders were out of sight. Then, without a word, he walked down towards her camp. He stopped a few paces away, his expression unreadable. He looked at the spot where the men had stood, then at Elara, his gaze steady. It was the first time she had seen his face clearly. It was weathered, lined, but his eyes, though serious, held no malice. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement. It was the most direct acknowledgement he had ever given her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He didn't reply with words. Instead, he gestured towards the path leading further up the valley, towards his cabin. It was an invitation, a silent offering of continued protection, of a shared refuge. Alara looked from the path to the empty valley below, then back at Kale. Her journey had started in despair, in flight from loss and cruelty. She had found herself alone, vulnerable, fearing she would perish in the wilderness. But in the heart of that wilderness, she had found not only unexpected help, but the stirrings of her own forgotten strength. She had faced the threat today, small and shaking, but defiant. The fear was still there, a memory, but it no longer defined her. She had endured, she had learned, and she was no longer utterly alone. The path ahead was still uncertain, the winter far from over, but for the first time in a long time, she looked towards it not with dread, but with a quiet, resilient hope. She met Kale's steady gaze, and slowly, deliberately, she nodded her head in return. The silence between them was not empty, but filled with understanding, with the unspoken language of shared survival. She turned towards the path, towards the future, walking not as a victim of circumstance, but as a survivor, alongside the silent man who had helped her find her way back to herself.